TWD, welcome to Together, and once again a thrilling episode with my friend Bill Mew. Bill, what is behind the US-China relationship and what is the threat? Could you shed some light on that?
Well, America has enjoyed economic dominance across so many different industries for so long that almost it's impossible to forget a time when they weren't dominant. If you take the auto industry, when we first saw the emergence of Japanese cars, many of the first iterations were fairly poor quality and they weren't really seen as much in the way of competition. Later on, the Japanese manufacturers actually surpassed many of the US manufacturers that were a little bit slow on innovation. And arguably, the US lost its lead in the automotive sector, and it employed various different tactics to prevent imports in order to defend its own car industry. Obviously, the tech sector is a potential parallel here. Again, we've got an emerging economy that is thriving and moving ahead at a really amazing pace. When you look at the Chinese economy, when they first started to get into the sort of tech arena, many of the competitors in China were simply producing gadgets, widgets, components for US tech firms. It is still the case that your iPhone or many of the laptops, the Cisco routers, everything else that you buy today, although it's American technology, much of that technology and most of the components are built in China. But obviously, China has ambitions to actually do more, just as the Japanese had ambitions in a different age with their automotive industry. And we're seeing this foremost with Huawei, who are really a giant in the technology arena. Now, I think it's accepted that in the past, the level of sophistication of some of the Chinese technology wasn't quite up to scratch. I think there was possibly a certain amount of intellectual property that was borrowed, or I'm not sure how you would phrase it, stolen, whatever. But much of that is in the past. And I think the main issue here is that the Chinese technology firms, and Huawei in particular, are investing an enormous amount in R&D and in innovation. I mean, Huawei, certainly, you look at some of the latest generation technologies, such as 5G in particular, Huawei has a massive lead over any of the European or American competitors in terms of the number of genuine patents and genuine technological breakthroughs it's made. And therefore, it's no longer the case that you can point the finger at Chinese and accuse them of not doing their own R&D and stealing the stuff from the Americans. To a very large extent, we're talking about genuinely new technology here with 5G. And we're talking about a genuine lead that the Chinese R&D has over many of its American peers. And we could go into great detail about what some of those innovations are, but some of them are truly leading. Obviously, that puts the Americans on the back foot, and that's not something that they like. And therefore, just as they sought to impose tariffs and import limits on Japanese cars, they're seeking to employ trade tactics on the Chinese. Unfortunately, rather than simply admitting that these are trade tactics, the Americans have sought to wrap this up in some sort of national security threat, which I think is a dangerous play, because in the future, if we do have genuine national security threats, then they're probably not going to be taken seriously. And where there are areas where Russia or China or others do genuinely pose a national security threat, they're not necessarily going to be genuinely recognized or taken seriously if we are just wantonly throwing such accusations out without necessary regard to any sort of factual evidence. And the accusations that Huawei routers and other 5G equipment has backdoors has been found to be false, and it's a very mendacious sort of attempt on the part of the Americans to put a genuine competitor at a disadvantage. So that's a real problem. But Huawei isn't the only company in their sights. I think there's a broader initiative here to take these sort of trade war tactics against the Chinese. And we've seen TikTok as well as another very public example of this. And also more recently, an executive order by Trump actually banning any sort of investment by Americans in a whole host of other technology companies in China. So it is a very broad tactic, and it is very much a trade war tactic that they're employing.
Exactly. Because as soon as we look at the content and the narrative behind those executive orders and behind those tactics, we see that they're, first of all, they're not really factual. And the second part is we can flip them around, and then we notice that a lot of these arguments also apply to the United States itself. The reasoning behind banning investment in Chinese companies are the ties to the military in China. Now, does that then also apply to, for example, Boeing, who makes a lot of profit in supplying fancy military technology to the United States military? Does that apply to all the other technology providers? Microsoft, the famous Jedi contract, are they now tied to the military, or is it a normal part of the economy?
Well, I think we need to go back to apply some international standards in terms of rule setting here. The World Trade Organization does not prohibit companies from trading just because they have supplied equipment, components, whatever, to their own national defense forces. Boeing would, as you say, would find it very difficult trading internationally if the World Trade Organization had such a rule. Now, I think it is undeniable that in its early days, Huawei benefited from a certain amount of advantage in having contracts with the Chinese military. It also had financial support in some of the financing deals it did with countries elsewhere. But again, you need to look at the World Trade Organization rules here. There are very well-defined rules for what is or is not defined as acceptable in terms of trade subsidies. And if you want to pursue that, somebody on that particular front, you can do so. And obviously, there's a big disagreement currently between Boeing and Airbus in terms of the subsidies that each one is arguing that the other one's getting. Exactly. So it's not exactly as clear-cut as you would think, but at least there would be some respect for the American argument if it was couched in terms of genuine international rules such as the WTO guidelines on subsidies.
And the fact is, and the United States doesn't want this to be communicated broadly, so let's do it. The annual reports of Huawei are audited like any other global company, because they also have to show that to their partners and to their customers. And those annual reports and the audits of those annual reports confirm what you said. That might have been a thing in the past, but in the last 10 years, financing, credit lines, subsidizations are all according to the global standards. So,
yeah, and I think you could have had accusations of the Japanese car industry in some of its early days that it actually possibly borrowed certain intellectual property, that it didn't churn out sort of the greatest equipment, that it benefited from certain local advantages or whatever. And when you have a fairly young market growing at that sort of rate, I think that is to be expected. But that is historical. If you look at the here and now, it is the case that Huawei is self-funding, that Huawei is abiding by any of the particular WTO rules that you would choose to point at them, and therefore I'm not sure there's really much grounds for complaint there. And more than anything, Huawei is investing an enormous amount in R&D, and the advantages that it currently has in areas like 5G and other technologies in this particular latest generation of new tech, and because it does more than just 5G, it's got its fingers in a number of different pies. The advantages that it have could be accused as cheating if you qualified R&D as cheating. I think R&D is actually genuinely innovation.
I think so too, and I want to add something, and that is factual, that is supported by statistics and data. There is no country in the world where there's so many law cases and penalties about patents and intellectual property infringements as in the United States, and that is mostly on the local market. You don't even hit the news anymore in the United States with patent infringements unless it's something big like Apple and Samsung, or Apple and Google and Apple. The list is endless, and it always turns in the same circle. And those are the ones in the
I'm
higher...
not sure I'm supporting the somewhat litigious model that they have in the US. I'm all for playing by the rules, and obviously, if we're talking about international trade here, the WTO does serve as a global body to whom you can take any particular complaints. But that's not what the Americans are doing. And therefore, I think it's somewhat hypocritical here. I really believe that the main evidence here is the fact that in its trade negotiations, rather than saying this terrible national security threat is something that is fairly insurpassable, we need you to do all of these different things in order to stop what is potentially or supposedly some terrible backdoor infringement and some sort of surveillance. But that's not what the Americans are saying in their trade negotiations. The trade negotiations, the Americans are saying, well, we'll let you off all of that if you agree to our trade terms. In other words, saying that actually, we know it's just a trade tactic, you know it's just a trade tactic, it's just we're not telling anyone else. But those supposed terrible national security threats, they're just going to disappear if you agree to our trade terms. Well, I mean, you can't take what they're saying about national security seriously if that's what they're saying in their trade talks.
Exactly, and it's the same with the TikTok case. We are very concerned about the privacy of your users. Unless the same data is collected by a US-based company, then we don't care anymore. That's not a right thing. But Bill, that brings us, I think, to a good end for this first episode on this topic. I'm sure that we're going to have a bunch of episodes more about this topic. So talk to you soon, Bill.
This has got a short way to go yet.